For Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for his speech and to split the time. I am somewhat reluctant to take the space today because this was a spot intended for my very good friend, the member from Abitibi James Bay, Nunavut EU, who is delayed in coming, and it was through his championing and my friend from Desette, Mississippi, Churchill River, who have been championing this process along for, in some cases, many, many years. We are going to be robbed of the wisdom of my friend from Abitibi James Bay. I will make a poor replacement, but I'll do my best to talk about this incredibly important opportunity, and maybe perhaps historic opportunity for us in the House of Commons to maybe be on the right side of history for once. This place that we occupy has been the figure and the symbol of the country, of the good and the bad of this country, of decisions that have been made in these parliaments that have deeply affected Indigenous peoples for many, many generations, too often to their great cultural, spiritual, and economic detriment. Here we have an opportunity to do something good. It's not going to solve everything. It's going to be an answer to some important things. Let me read from the United Nations, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 13. Indigenous people have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. And Section 2 says this, and this is important to this debate, because this House has adopted this principle. This House has adopted this UN declaration that says that states shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected, and also to ensure that Indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative proceedings where necessary through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means. Well, this is that place. If we are going to pay any honoring to the House of Commons passing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was also pushed forward by my friend from Abitibi James Bay, Nunavut EU, then we have to act. Many of us have heard the terms from the Prime Minister and many politicians talking about reconciliation. And the place that I come from and represent in northwestern British Columbia, the first question people often ask is, what does that mean? Don't tell me, show me. Reconciliation can be defined in many ways and is often ill-defined or not defined at all. And I believe in showing and demonstrating what it might be. I spoke to my Conservative colleague earlier about what privilege, one small aspect of privilege is as a non-Indigenous person, as an English-speaking person, which is I can move about the world, perform my duties to the best of my ability in my mother tongue, without hesitation or pause, to express my thoughts and feelings to the best of my ability. I have no barrier between me and that expression, whereas so many people do not have that privilege. And Indigenous people in particular have had that ability supplanted, oppressed, and taken away categorically and systemically by the state. That is one of the facets of colonialism. And people can brace at that word and say, oh, that's some ancient history. Well, the fact of this country, Canada, which we so love, is that it will remain incomplete in its aspirations until we are able to address some of the fundamental errors we made. And these are long struggles. These are struggles that bridge generation to generation. And as we witness in our lifetime, Mr. Speaker, you and I, watching languages move from threatened to endangered to extinct, and somehow we believe that we bear no responsibility to this, that the arguments are put forward as we discuss this small but important change in how the People's House, this House of Commons, conducts its business. We hear resistance. We hear reasons bordering on excuses, that the technical challenges of accommodating the 3 or 4 speakers who might use those interpretation services, the cost concerns for a federal government that spends north of $330 billion a year. Oh, we wouldn't want to deprave some community of their interpreter as if providing interpretation work to Indigenous speakers would somehow hurt Indigenous interpreters. It's ridiculous. We need to not be looking for excuses to say no, but understand and compel ourselves to the reasons to say yes to this report and say yes to this change in the House of Commons. I have an incomplete list here, but in northwestern British Columbia, I have had the privilege of hearing Haida, Tsimshian, Gitxsan, Niska, Wet'suwet'en, Tahltan, Tlingit, Carrier, Heiltsuk, Newhawk spoken at what we would call parliaments, when the people gather, when the people feast, when the people celebrate and honor those that they seek to hold up, and when the people are doing their business in the northwest of British Columbia. Because at those feast halls, Parliament is held for the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Niska, and on down the list. I should have started my speech with something I've never said in this House, which is Denize Sakoze Skyze, Tabe Masai, for people to listen to me here today. I and my family occupy Wet'suwet'en territory. Our house is in Wet'suwet'en territory. I'm a Nidu, white guy, happens to live with and alongside many friends of the Wet'suwet'en nation. And they have welcomed me and my family in ways that I can't properly express without getting even more emotional than this debate feels to me now here today. But the generosity of trying to bridge the gap between non-Wet'suwet'en and Wet'suwet'en, in my experience, has been breathtaking in its scope and its determination to treat me as a resident of the territories, Gidimt'en territories, to accept me as a representative of the Crown, this place, in Wet'suwet'en and other territories. Considering all of the terrible things that people who stood in my place in generations past have done to Indigenous peoples is humbling and remarkable. We often, you'll hear politicians, certainly on the West Coast, but other places, begin their speeches by saying, I'm pleased to be here on unceded territory. And sometimes I'm in the audience and I'm wondering, what does that actually mean? Is it just a phrase that gets put into a speech for politicians to say and then move on to say the things they were going to say anyways? Or that when we recognize unceded territory, we recognize something more? We say that these territories were not ceded, that the imposition of a colonial legal language and morality system has never been recognized, has never been accepted, that we require of Indigenous peoples to move through these systems in order to achieve basic rights and meaning and title, and fighting year after year against various iterations of the government, of the Crown, at the Supreme Court. And recently, I heard a story that I think is important from a former colleague who was here during the reclaiming of the reconstituting of our Constitution here in Canada, done by a former Prime Minister Trudeau. And in those negotiations with the NDP, Ed Broadbent was a leader at the time, we had in principle accepted the Constitution as it was written. But unfortunately for Mr. Broadbent, but fortunately for us, his caucus resisted. This is the plight of being the NDP leader sometimes, I suppose. And there were certain sections that the caucus at that time in the early 80s insisted on being in. One was the rights of women to be declared in the Constitution, and the other was Section 35. And Mr. Broadbent had to go back to Mr. Trudeau and say, we need these in. And there was resistance. There was clear resistance from this place, from this institution, to include Section 35, Indigenous rights and title, in our Constitution, which includes things like language, in the rights that people bear. And what are we talking about here today? Is the rights of Indigenous people to stand in this place and express themselves without the barrier of having to move through somebody else's language. To have the ability to move and express themselves through their language. And we have the ability to do this. For those that say it's too technical or there might be costs that we can't even imagine, I say this should have been done generations ago. Let's be on the right side of history. Let's not allow these things to stand in our way, because we can do this. This Parliament can do this. In 2018, a small but important expression to people, not just Indigenous people, Mr. Speaker, and I'll end here, but to non-Indigenous Canadians, to say this is what the People's House looks like and this is what the People's House sounds like. To not move in this direction, Canada cannot be the country that it hopes and professes to be. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments?